welcome to Troon Vineyard. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. The original vines were planted in 1972 by Dick Troon. Beautiful. We'll have enough wine for them, no worries. Could you grab some more water, Sabrina? So Dick Troon planted the vines in 1972.
I didn't get it. This is my water glass, okay?
Oh, yep, we're gonna need an empty glass if you want to taste it.
Oh yes, I need an empty one too.
No worries at all. Settle on it.
Okay, this is you'll tell us.
Yeah, oh, I'll tell you all about it. Don't you even worry.
1972.
1972, yeah.
Empty glass and a water glass.
Okay.
And there's 2 empty glasses here.
Paid off for me, all right?
Troon Vineyard, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. The first vines were planted in 1972. This is one of the first vineyards that was planted in this area after Prohibition. It was actually a very prolific grape growing area in the 1880s. Prohibition hit, everything was ripped out and replaced with orchards. But it's okay because the grapes are back and we're super excited about it. We're kicking off with our Côte de Coubly White. This is a Côte de Rhône style blend. So the grapes are originally from the Rhône region of France. Roussanne, Marsanne, and Viognier. This style of blend is known for having floral notes, some texture on the palate that you don't often find in a white wine, some weight to it, as well as some nice, bright, spicy acidity. I love this one for pairing with food. It's fantastic with like a creamy seafood pasta, like, oh my goodness, or on just a hot day. It's also very delicious. This is our Côte de Coubly White. So Côte de Coubly, we're on the Coubly bench here. That's the geological formation that we are sitting on here. A bench is a raised piece of land between 2 riverbeds. And it's what gives us our unique microclimate here to be able to grow these Rhone varietals very well. We're on the same latitude as the Rhone region of France, which also makes us pretty great for growing these Rhone varietals. We do a lot of blends here. You'll be tasting a couple different blends today. We focus on very clean winemaking out at Troon. So while there are about 100 additives that you can legally put in wine that are not grapes, we don't use those. Instead of having a bunch of different ingredients in the cellar, we view our vineyard as our ingredients. So if something in a given year doesn't have enough acidity, hopefully another grape has that acidity that we can throw on in to make a more balanced blend. So as I mentioned, Viognier, Marsanne, and Roussanne. Viognier doesn't have a lot of acidity oftentimes, so that's why you see it paired with Roussanne and Marsanne to just brighten it up. So that's just a little bit of background on Troon. Do I have any questions to get us kicked off at all?
I'm not a...
This is a 2020.
No. How old is the wine?
The first vines were planted in 1972. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Yeah, so the land was originally owned by Virginia Troon, who married Dick Troon in the 60s. It was a cattle ranch. But they knew that they wanted to have something productive on the land, so they were actually tied between olive trees and grapevines. So glad they chose grapes. Olive oil tasting so boring. They just dip bread. It's not even fun. So yeah, actually an OSU professor partnered with Dick Troon to bring cuttings back to this area because, again, it was so prolific in the 1880s, and they knew that it had the perfect climate for a lot of different varietals. So ended up working out for us. Dick Troon was a huge part of the community and helped a lot of other vineyards get their start as well. So we have Dick Troon to thank for a lot of the wineries that we have in this area. And I'll be right back with our rosé. Enjoy this white blend to start. It's a great thing. No, that brings up a great topic that we'll definitely discuss, all the wildlife we have on the property. But first I'll tell you a little bit about the rosé. This is so the last blend we have was very traditional. You'll find a lot of wines that have those 3 grapes in them. This is not. This is Malbec, something that grows really well on the property and has grown here for years. It also has Tinto Roriz, which is Portuguese Tempranillo, which is a grape that has grown here for a while but doesn't do too hot, so we've actually retired this year. And Counois, which is very French, and this is actually our first harvest of Counois. So it's sort of an out with the old, in with the new blend here. Just a bright, fun, fresh rosé, honestly. For those of you locally, like, this is going down the Rogue River with me this summer. We're definitely floating with a bottle of this. It's just fresh. My gardening is way more fun when I have a glass of rosé out there with me. But we brought up a good point talking about our woodpeckers. We try our best to be a wildlife refuge out here. We welcome the outside animals to come on in. It's a pretty good sign that you're taking good care of your land if other animals want to live here. the bird watching about 5:30 is always pretty exceptional. But we're a biodynamic farm here, so part of what that means is, one, we have a very rigorous composting program. So in addition to, of course, being biodynamic and not using anything gross and man-made on our vines, we also have a very rigorous composting program using botanicals and native fermentations to add microbes back into the soil and regenerate our soil health.
Does that add to the regenerative organic?
Yeah, so that's part of the regenerative organic, right? Organic tells you what you can't put on your vines. It's pretty simple, just like don't put that icky stuff that we always are trying to wash off our vegetables when we buy them at the farmers or at the grocery store. Organic or regenerative organic and biodynamic go the next step of, well, let's actually give back to the soil, but things that are natural, things that are naturally occurring, giving them back to the soil. That also means we operate as a farm here. The more diverse your piece of property is, the healthier it will be. You can think back to pre-industrial revolution. Farms were small and you had to grow everything on one piece of land because that's really all you could do. So you had a very diverse piece of land where everything was exposed to everything else. So they had really good immune systems, kind of like exposing a kid to a bunch of stuff early on so they don't get sick. Same sort of thing that we're doing here. We have an 1.5 acre vegetable garden. We'll actually be selling our produce out of our farm stand right here. We have 20 sheep, 50 chickens. Their eggs are absolutely incredible. And the sheep and chickens' jobs is just mowing and fertilizing. That's all they do. They go between the vines, they nom on the grass, they leave a little bit behind, and they do
eat the insects.
Yeah, chickens are great pest control as well. Now when it comes to bigger pests, you know, we do see our little gophers. I just noticed a little pile of dirt from a gopher earlier today. We have gophers and all things like that. But to keep the balance, we also welcome barn owls to the property by having barn owl boxes that our team has made here. So you'll see some big boxes out on sticks. That's for us to welcome the barn owl boxes, to let just the circle of life happen on the property, right? You don't have to use traps and gross poison and things like that if you just kind of let nature do its thing. So that's what we're seeking to do on the property. Set up a lot of things ahead of time to just let the property sort of maintain itself in the long run.
How about bats?
Bats, yeah, bats are really beneficial. We will be installing bat boxes soon. We have a ton of bats on the property. That's a great question. That's very in right now. For those of you who are scared of bats, I'm sorry, you will see more bat boxes popping up in neighborhoods. That's very in vogue right now. Yes? Yeah, so rose bushes on the end of a row is very traditional. We even used to have those here ourselves. One, it's tradition. It's something, lots of wine stuff is steeped in tradition. Two, it also was thought to attract pests to the roses rather than to the vines. So you'll see that like in very old school, especially like Italian vineyards, they'll have roses on the end of their rows. Great question.
About the tall fences along the road, is that for the open range cattle, deer?
The tall fences, like on our property?
No, coming in down farther down.
Oh, it's probably for the open range cattle. We have a lot of cattle like ranches around here still. That's very big around here, including Noble Dairy just across the street,
Right.
which is actually where we source our manure from. So our manure is just a block away from us. Organic cattle ranch manure. We get about 400 tons of it a year.
Yeah.
As part of our compost. Yeah, great question. Any other questions?
Do you get wiped out by deer?
Wiped out by deer? That's a fantastic question. We actually, we had to chase out a deer the other day who came into here. They normally don't find themselves on the property. It's kind of hard for them to get here. That being said, deer aren't going to decimate your whole grape population if it's just a couple of them. It's not really their thing. Grapevines don't taste very good. It's the grapes that taste good. And grapevines are very smart. They develop when bud burst happens, which is when like the cluster starts forming on a vine. It just looks like a green BB and then a green marble. It's just hard and sour and green until the seed inside is ready. And then the vine will be like, okay, now I can look yummy. Now I can add some sugar so that birds will eat me now, so that that seed is ready. So when it gets pooped out, they can spread it. So yeah, grapes aren't tasty for a very long time while they're ripening. They don't get tasty until about a month before harvest. Yeah, great question. Any other questions? Sabrina, could you get some water over here?
I'm on it.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Go get another one. Yeah. Between the white blend and the rosé, what was the favorite?
Rosé.
Rosé.
See, okay. See, there's no clear winner. That's what I like to hear.
Can't get along.
Yeah, so they're all white. And they're kind of like polar bears. They look huge. They are huge. They're over 100 pounds. Yeah, they're gigantic dogs. So we're moving into our first red of the day. This is our Côte de Coubly red. So you had the Côte de Coubly white earlier. That was our white Rhone blend. This is our red Rhone blend. Syrah and Grenache. Some people might be familiar with a GSM blend. That's Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre. Also a very common blend. But Syrah and Grenache are really the two opposites attract grapes in here, which is what you want in a blend. A good blend, just like a good relationships, they balance each other out. What one brings, the other one brings something different, right? In this case, the Syrah is a great base note. It has those riper fruit notes, has a smoother tannin to it. This Grenache, on the other hand, these Grenache grapes specifically, really tannic. It brings this playful tannin to your palate, this playful texture, and then this nice bright tart raspberry acidity as well. So very fun combination of grapes. I like to give wines personality, and again, I will say this one is very playful to me. It just has some spice, some fruit, some creaminess as well. So I wanted to make sure that I covered everything. You guys asked some great questions, so now I'm having to go through and make sure that we remember remembering everything. Talked about yeast. Thank you. Yeah, talk about yeast. So sometimes when people throw out words like yeast, bacteria, microbes, we think of bad things. Yeast is what makes wine. Yeast is good. It makes bread, it makes beer, it makes delicious things. And there is an industry within the wine industry for commercial yeast, where you can buy packets of Sauvignon Blanc yeast, where if you pour it into your Sauvignon Blanc juice, it'll make sure your Sauv Blanc tastes like Sauv Blanc. For us, we are just using the yeast on the skins of the grapes. That naturally occurs. There's yeast on our skin, there's yeast in the air, there's yeast everywhere. And so we're just using the stuff that's on the skin of the grapes. That's how they did it before they understood that yeast even existed, right? Wine has been made for thousands of years. They just knew that if they crushed the grapes, that something fun happened. They started bubbling, they started getting warm, and then we would get wine. So for us, that means that our wine tastes like our place. What that means is it has terroir. If you want to throw out a French word during a tasting, terroir is a great one. Your friends will be very impressed. So that means it has a sense of place. Our yeast is unique to our location. There are 1,000 yeast strains on our property that have never been discovered outside of our location. And that's not just because of here, that's something that you'd find anywhere that has a healthy microbiome. So that means that, yeah, our Syrah might not taste like a classic Syrah sometimes, but that's because it depends on the yeast in a given year. And we have to think about, when I mentioned biodiversity, it's important to have a lot of different plants, a lot of different animals on your piece of property. That also lends to the yeast population being very healthy. If this was a monoculture or just grapes, we might not have enough healthy yeast strains on the skins of our grapes to even start a fermentation, which would force us to dump yeast in after the fact, which just sort of takes away from our sense of terroir that we get from our grapes. So we're very happy. We've noticed through the years as we've continued to be biodynamic that our ferments are actually getting healthier and healthier and happening more and more rapidly. Though we were very patient when they weren't going too fast either, because it's definitely worthwhile for us to only be using that native yeast. So if you look at the back of some of our bottles, we actually have an ingredients list, which is not required. You will not find it on most wine, but it just says biodynamic organic grapes and minimum effective sulfites. Just enough sulfites, about 1/10 of what you'll find in grocery store wine, to make sure it's shelf-stable, so that when you open a bottle, you know it's going to be good.
I know, it didn't have a bite for me when I drink red wine. It's like, ugh.
Yeah, that can be a couple different things. Like, everyone's palate's different. Everyone perceives things differently. Sometimes that can be oak. We do neutral oak for all of our wines, which means that the barrels have been used in at least 4 or 5 harvests. So we buy our barrels from reputable Pinot Noir makers who we know treat their barrels very nicely and keep them very clean. And then we use them until they leak. So you're not going to get that oakiness, which some people really enjoy in wine, and it's a great characteristic. But it can actually have histamines in it that people are allergic to. So a lot of people think they're allergic to red wine because of histamines and oak. So if you find that red wine, you have an allergic reaction to it, look for unoaked reds. That's just, so don't do Napa. Don't do that. It's all oaked out there. Don't do Chardonnay. Lots of Chardonnays are oaked. Don't do that if you find that you're sensitive to oaked wine. So yeah, that's a great note. Now, bite can also be like acidity or hot. It can be hot because of how high in alcohol it is. Our wines out here are very light in alcohol. The highest we'll go today is 14.5%. Down in California, you'll see 17% alcohol. A very hot wine is what we'd call that. But since we have a cooler climate out here, you're gonna have a lot less alcohol because you have a lot less sugar in your grapes when we're picking them. So yeah, it can be perceived in a lot of different ways, but that's a great thing to pick up on, absolutely.
In your biodynamic,
Yeah.
do you do your farming by the phase of the moon?
Absolutely.
And the signs of the zodiac?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, we go pre-industrial revolution in a lot of our farming. So old farmers' almanacs were always based on the phase of the moon. We go back to that. We just take that extra step. It's very easy to say, well, let's not do this day. Let's just do it the next day, because that's when we're in the correct phase. Now, do some people find that a little goofy? Sure. But it's how they used to do it. And back when they used to do it that way, they didn't have to use all that gross man-made stuff. So they're probably doing something right. Our winemaker likes to say, you know, out of the people who go to the Olympics, it's like a 2% difference between someone who gets last place and someone who gets first. And it's just that tiny little difference that makes that huge difference. So he's always like, why not put in that extra 2%? Why not do that other thing just to push us that little bit further?
Does that also drive harvesting, or are you looking for a certain level of sugar?
Yeah, so harvest for the most part is driven very much by the amount of sugar, but more importantly by the amount of acid in our grapes. So a lot of wineries are picking on sugar or picking on bricks, which means that they're looking for a certain bricks content, which is the measure of sugar, BRX, in order to pick, because their wine cannot go over a certain alcohol percentage. For us, we pick on acidity because it's more important to us that our wine has a lot of acidity. We know it's not going to be very high in alcohol, but acidity is very important in a wine. It's what makes it balanced. It's what makes it fun. It's what makes your mouth water and make you want to take another sip of it. So yeah, it's much more about picking on those things that we can measure, but when we can, we do want to make sure it's also in phase with the farmer's almanac. Absolutely.
So I noticed you're non-trellis, so everything is picked by hand.
Yeah, so we have two different ways that we train our vines. We do have VSP, which is vertical shoot positioning. It's like sort of the this one on our older vines. And then we do head training, which is the big bush on top of a single cane. And yeah, it's all done by hand. It's a 100-acre property, but only 40 acres of grapes. And it's about a 6-week process to harvest. But during the harvest, it's not just picking grapes. We're also actively making wine, because you have to start that as soon as the grapes are picked. So it's quite a long process. We bring in a team for that who works on our vines year round and then really puts in 110% harvesting the grapes during the harvest time. Yeah. Yes?
Do you have to bring in any grapes from other
That's a great question. So in 2017, when the White family purchased the property, we knew that we wanted to start making the change to biodynamic. Part of that was making sure that we had grapes that wanted to grow here, not grapes that we wish wanted to grow here. A great example is the Zinfandel that we'll be trying next. So we did take out some vines and did source some grapes from our partners further into the Applegate at Cowhorn Vineyard. They're also biodynamic. So some of our wines out there, or some of our grapes, are sourced out at Cowhorn. Yeah, great question. We're hoping to be full estate in the next year.
Who's your winemaker?
Yeah, our winemaker is Nate Wall, and our assistant winemaker is Hannah Thorning. Nate Wall and Hannah both have Pacific Northwest winemaking training. Hannah also has spent a lot of time in biodynamic communities in Austria as well. It's huge in Europe, the biodynamic process. So yeah, kind of a slew of different things. Nate Wall used to do cider making as well. We actually have an apple orchard on the property, and we'll be making French style cider in the next few years. We're pretty excited about it. Yeah. Yes.
Jim Arnold,
Yeah, so terroir, when we say terroir, that's like sense of place. I would say how we define our climate is more like microclimate would be potentially a better word, and we say it's Mediterranean out here. So believe it or not, even though the coast is 50 miles away, we have Ashland and Medford that get very hot. Hot air rises, the cool air wants to fill that space, which gives us this very dependable breeze that is doing a great job showcasing itself right now. So we get a coastal breeze despite being so far inland, so that leads us to being more Mediterranean. Yeah, great question. And yeah. Let's go on.
Yes.
Next wine, I'll be right back.
Cuvée
This is a blend
Pyrenees.
cuvée of the great
Cuvées. Okay.
This is what we gave Chris.
Yeah, this smells more
Okay.
like one to me.
What's your educational background?
I'm gonna take another sip.
I have a degree in engineering and a year and a half in the wine industry.
Wow.
You know your stuff.
Thank you. This one is our Cuvée Pyrenees. Yeah. Wow. This is a Tannat Malbec blend.
Again, not bad.
We are going to make port, actually. Yeah, it's a great question. So we, port is, of course, fortified wine. Typically, like champagne, it can't be called port unless it's from Portugal. That being said, we'll make a port-style wine. We actually have someone who's distilling our Vermentino grapes into brandy for us right now, so that we can have a port-style wine. It will be about 5 years from now.
No.
Port takes a long time in the barrel.
Tough for you.
Alrighty. So this is a Tannat Malbec blend. As I mentioned, we've all probably heard of Malbec. You see it a lot in the grocery store. It oftentimes comes from Argentina. It's a big grape out there. It's soft, it's plush, it's velvety, it's plums, it's violets. It's just a really lovely, very purple grape. Tannat, on the other hand, though it's from the same region of France, the Pyrenees region, is a lot less common. It's has the root word tan, same root as the word tannin. It is a very tannic grape. It has a lot of that drying sensation on the palate, very high acidity. It was exported to Uruguay in the 1880s and actually has become their national grape out there. So if you find Tannat at your local wine shop, it's probably from Uruguay. Ours is done more in the French style here, so it's a little bit more soothed. Again, we're doing the neutral oak. This is our probably biggest red blend here. So this is a co-fermentation rather than a traditional blend. In a traditional blend, you make two different wines, and then you try them at like 25-75%, 50-50. You know, you try and see what percentage feels right and tastes the best. For this one, we throw the grapes in together from the start. They get crushed together, they ferment together. And when you're integrating anything during the fermentation stage, it's going to get way better integrated because that's when all the biology is happening. That's when it's hot, that's when it's bubbling. So these really, when we do it in this fashion, it sort of makes its own varietal at the end of the day. So very cool, very elegant blend. It is such an opposites attract blend. Again, Malbec is very soothing and soft. Tannat is feisty and tannic, and having them come together in this blend just creates a really lovely, lovely wine. Yeah? Any questions? This is the last
Do all
one.
that here.
Yeah, so all of our winemaking is done on site. This is the tasting room building, which is also where the bathroom is for people who need it before they leave. And then this building here is our winery and cellar. So it all happens on site. Yeah, it's a good question. You want your grapes to travel as little as possible. I found out the other day that Connecticut buys a lot of its grapes from California. And Connecticut law is that only 10% of the grapes have to be from Connecticut to call it Connecticut wine. So Oregon, it's like 95%. In California, it's also pretty high. So anyways, so that's fun. You don't want your grapes to be traveling that far ever. So yeah, we do it all on site.
How are they stored? Do you
How
have a
are they
basement?
stored?
I mean, an underground thing?
Yeah, so our wines are stored in our cellar, which is kept at 55 degrees. Oftentimes you'll also see people making caves for their cellar. Back in the old times, thousands of years ago, they dropped their vessels into the ocean or bury them underground to do temperature control. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
What do we think of that white blend?
Yeah, so I'll be taking
Isn't
the
that
bottle.
fun? Yeah, it's so good. It has a lot of interest to it, but it's not like too complex. It's not asking too much of you when you're drinking.
Faith,
Yes.
this isn't a test.
Okay.
It's a word that I remembered when I took a geography class when I was in college. It was a wine tasting thing, and there's a word that I heard, and I don't remember what it means exactly. It has something to do with fungus or something. It's phylloxera.
Phylloxera. It's a mite. It's a root mite. Yes, you are absolutely correct. So pretty much every grape grown in the world is American rootstock grafted to an American grapevine. We're not over here. And that's because phylloxera is a mite that American grapes adapted to. It was a mite that was native to America. But when international trade started happening in like the 1860s, the mite ended up crossing over to Europe. Their grapes were not ready for it, and it almost decimated the entire wine growing operation of Europe. But thankfully, it happened at a time where we knew how to graft. So again, pretty much every grapevine in the world is a Native American root stock, because it only attacks roots, grafted to a European grape. Because American grapes do not make good wine, but European grapes do. So yeah, we nearly didn't have wine in Europe, which would have been a big problem.
If I come here at 5:30, will you let me in?
5:30, we close at 5.
No, a.m.
Oh,
to see the bird.
Oh no, 5:30 is the best time of day.
It's so
5:30
cute.
at night is actually a great time of day to bird watch.
Little bitty frog.
And then he watches birds.
He's crawling through the grass. He's
I love that.
There he
5:30 at
goes.
night and 5:30 in the morning.
Talk about biodiversity.
Alrighty folks, we are kicking off with some Zinfandel.
So eggs are woodpecker.
I mentioned that we're doing some replanting right now. Zinfandel is one of those grapes that does not like it here. It needs to be hot. I'm from Lodi, California. Really great area for Zinfandel because it's flat and hot all the time. And Zin grapes love that. That's how you get that really high alcohol, really inky, really thick Zin from California. That's great around like a campfire or in front of your fire during the winter time. Fantastic wine for that. This is a Zin from this climate here, so it's a lot cooler. I mentioned earlier, if it's cooler, your grapes are going to get less ripe. Less ripe means more acid, less sugar, which means lower alcohol and a brighter wine. So Zin is a stubborn grape. It still has some hallmarks of Zinfandel. It's peppery, it's plum-y, it's jammy, but in this lighter and brighter package. Dick Troon planted Zin and Pinot Noir in the 1970s here. This is before UC Davis did a bunch of work on what grapes should grow where. Zin and Pinot should not grow anywhere near each other, let alone here. So he had a 50% success rate or failure rate, depending if you're a half empty, half full person. But after that, we've done a lot of soil samples and weather samples or weather studies to see what should really grow here. We dug 58 pits along the property to test our soil types. We have a bunch of different soil here. What's cool about this area with riverbeds and with mountains and being near the coast is that there's been a ton of geological activity around here, whether it's volcanic or just purely plates shifting over time. So we have a whole beautiful array of different soils all throughout our vineyard. There are some places where we decided, okay, then we won't grow grapes there, and certain places where we'll grow certain grapes there and other grapes over here, depending on particularly how much water they're going to get from that soil type. So yeah, you can take a very scientific approach to your farming to make it way easier by the time you get into the cellar to be pretty non-invasive because your grapes are so happy. So yeah, that's a huge part of what we're doing out here.
You do a lot of irrigation.
That's a great question. So grapes are pretty resilient to drought. That's why it's a huge thing in California. They can do that. So grapes have one taproot that goes straight down to groundwater. So they just take up from groundwater. It's very easy to dry farm grapes as long as you are encouraging root growth. So for us, through our composting program, we make sure we are encouraging root growth during the non-harvest times of year so that they're always able to get water. We only fertigate for the most part, which is distributing water to the vines that contain nutrients. So specifically getting nutrients to the vine through drops of water. So we're moving towards dry farming, but you'll find more and more often that people are moving towards dry farming with grapes because it's pretty easy too. Yeah, that's a good question. We do have wells on the property for when we need it, but for the most part, grapes are pretty happy without too much water. You do want a little bit of struggle. We have a couple different soil types on the property, as I mentioned. Something that's very commonly found is you will have a clay soil type. Clay is a very tiny particle, which means it holds water a lot more than maybe like gravel would. So you actually don't want to plant grapes in clay, which is why we did that soil sample to make sure we didn't, because it'll make your roots rot out because they'll be just way too moist. On the other hand, the vineyard that we source our grapes from farther into the Applegate is on an old riverbed. It's very gravelly. Their grapes get no water and therefore have a lot thicker skins. Just like humans, the more struggle you go through, the thicker your skin is. And so they have very different grapes compared to us because of purely the soil that they're grown on. Yeah. Alrighty, I'm making sure that we're keeping good time, so I'm going to be back with our last.
Sip it quickly.
Sip it elegantly.
Excuse me. I knew that was going to come up.
No, I had a young lady the other day that was celebrating her 21st birthday, and she was like, "Wow, this wine's like so chuggable." And I'm like, you know what? I don't endorse, but I don't judge too much. Yeah.